Bienvenue, I'm theoliverpickard and welcome to a very hot and steamy Limousin, France. And because it's hot and steamy, we've come into the woods and we've got two hot and steamy, sexy little 2CVs. This one, as you all know, is my lean, green, beautiful Jolene, my 1963 AZA, and this one belongs to my friends Amandine and Guillaume, and this is a 1987-1988 model year, because it was made in December, 2CV6 Special. Believe it or not, these two cars are massively different, but we're not doing a versus this time. And the reason we're not doing a versus, I've done a versus in the past, Diane versus AZA, and Diane people got really angry. I'm not doing a versus because I'm afraid of people getting angry. I'm not doing a versus because mechanically this 2CV6 is virtually identical underneath to a Diane. But as a 2CV, there are many differences between this car and this car, to the point where they actually drive completely differently. They not only look different, they sound different, they're different to sit in. And like I said, they drive completely differently. You would, if you drove them blindfolded, which I don't advise you do, you could be forgiven for thinking they are completely different cars. And we'll start from the back and work our way forwards. But before we do that, this car and this car have one very big difference. And that is that only one of them is actually French. Yes, I know what you're thinking, they're both 2CVs, they're both Citroens, and they are the most French cars in the world, and I must be crazy, but I'm not. Because this car was made in Portugal, in Vigo. Every single 2CV after 1984 was actually made in Vigo, Portugal. And a bunch of 2CV Saharas and a bunch of other 2CVs were also made in Spain. So it's not the only Spanish 2CV, there's actually, or Portuguese 2CV, there is actually a bunch of them. And 2CVs were made all over the world. But because we're comparing this car and this car, like, you know, if you're in Iran or if you're in Chile, you'll be going, hang on a minute, we have 2CVs as well. Yes, I know you have 2CVs were made there, but I'm comparing these two cars. And when this car was built, there were no French 2CVs. French 2CV production had shut down completely. Whereas when Jolene was made in 1963, she was driven down the Champs-Élysées after she was built. And that's about as French as you can get. A bunch of people on YouTube refer to French cars as being Parisian. Most of them aren't. But Jolene actually is, for better or for worse. Now then, let's start at the back. So, obvious things, Jolene has no third window. Third windows are a 1965 AZA thing, and the actual back panel of the body is different as well. 2CV6 has some big, meaty, chunky brake lights with built-in indicators and stuff, whereas Jolene has the 1950s back panel. And of course, Jolene has a side indicator, which is red, which is completely illegal in the UK. But in the time on the continent, a lot of cars had red indicator lights, as do a bunch of American cars. Underneath the cars are completely different. The 2CV6 has a much stronger chassis. One of the issues with the earlier cars is that they used to bend the front chassis legs if they were driven spiritedly, shall we say. And most 2CVs were driven spiritedly because that's how you drive a 2CV. It's too tempting not to. However, both of these chassis of both of these cars have both been replaced, and that's because even though 2CV6s have a much stronger chassis and that problem was completely removed, they do rot. And so because of that, this car actually has a galvanised chassis, a brand new galvanised chassis. Jolene, I think, has a new chassis under her, I'm not quite sure, but it's quite a common practice. And so both of these cars, like I say, brand new chassis, but the 2CV6 chassis is much, much stronger. And bolted to that chassis is, of course, suspension. Now, Jolene has no shock absorbers, and she's very, very floppy. Whereas the 2CV6 is much, sorry I'm undine, much firmer sprung. And that's about as much as you're going to get out of it, really. They have shock absorbers fitted front and rear, luxury. Whereas Jolene only has friction clutches which are mounted on the end of the suspension arms. And what they are just basically, it's a bit like it's a clutch. It's like a brake. And when the suspension arm goes up too much, the two pads pull together and it stops it going too far. And on the front, it also has bastons. I forgot to mention in another video what bastons actually are. Bastons are basically a tube full of hydroelastic oil. It's the same fluid that you put in DS suspension, some Minis, some Rolls Royces and stuff. And it has a big spring and a big weighted ball. And it's an inertial damper, so it stops the front wheels bouncing. Although they do tend to do it under hard braking. With the 2CV6s, with their shock absorbers, you don't get the same kind of front wheel judder under hard braking. And with this one especially, because it has uprated shock absorbers. The shock absorbers have been replaced with fancier ones that are much better quality than the original ones. In fact, this car's been completely restored, just like Jolene has. Although he's got some non-Michelin tyres on, which are low profile. So much stiffer springs and shock absorbers, whereas super soft springs and no shock absorbers, just friction clutches and bastons. A 2CV6 has a locking fuel cap, so nobody can nick his fuel. I don't have a locking fuel cap, it just wasn't an issue back then. The boot space is exactly the same, the boot door is exactly the same, the boot door handle is exactly the same. These cars share the same sort of roof. Another difference, obviously, is that Guillaume's doors open the wrong way and my doors open the right way. But Guillaume does have a 1950, Guillaume and Amandine have a 1959, which is called Tetanus, which has been in another video of mine. And of course, the other striking difference between these two cars is that 2CV6s have an indicator up front, whereas Jolene doesn't. She just relies on that tiny little side indicator. And the grills are different. The last year of Jolene's grill is 1965, and Doudou, being a 1968-67, has a plastic grill and of course black rubbing strips, whereas Jolene has aluminium rubbing strips. Added to that, it also has two wing mirrors, not just the one. Jolene has a back bench, as does the 2CV6, but that's where the similarity ends. The front seats of this are symmetrical bucket seats. There are two sorts of bucket seats, single seats, for 2CV6s. There are symmetrical bucket seats, which are both equal and round-topped, and there are asymmetric bucket seats. Asymmetric bucket seats are fitted in Dianes and a bunch of other stuff, and they go up, and as they reach each other, they kind of point to each other. But this, being a 2CV6 special, has symmetrical bucket seats. Jolene has the front bench from an AZA. Jolene originally didn't have the nice padded benches that she has now. She was sold with the hammock seats, being an AZA, but being a 63, it is the first year of the AZAM, and the AZAM was fitted with a bench. And sometime in Jolene's life, Jolene has been fitted with an AZAM front bench seat, so I have a fancy sliding bench seat, whereas this 2CV6 has two sliding bucket seats. Inside, they have different pedals. Jolene has what the French call the mushroom pedals, which slide kind of directly into the firewall, and they rely on a linkage which is actually in the engine bay. Whereas Doodoo here has top hinged modern style car pedals, as well as a different steering column and a smaller steering wheel because it has easier steering. Moving on from the steering, power gets to the wheels by CV joints, which are now the modern status quo for all front wheel drive cars, and it's the shaft that takes the power from the gearbox to the front wheels, and it uses two universal kind of ball bearing joints, and it means that when you steer in tight spaces and when you apply lock, you don't get judder or anything, and the car can give good power to the front wheels. Jolene, being an early front wheel drive car, or I know there are pre-war front wheel drive cars, but an early production front wheel drive car, she has early DS traction advance style CV joints, which means there's a universal joint at one end and kind of just a hinge joint at the other. This means that the 2CV6 has much more lock than Jolene. Jolene's actually incredibly difficult to park if you aren't familiar with 2CVs, and at low speed and full lock she jumps up and down, and you kind of do this as you go along until you straighten the wheel, and that's simply because the CV joint is canted over at an angle and it tends to jump like this rather than both roll smoothly. Bolted to those CV joints are of course the brakes. On a 2CV, the brakes are inboard, which means they're bolted to the gearbox, not to the wheels. And Jolene has tiny little drum brakes, whereas the 2CV6 has disc brakes, much improved, and that came in I think 1982, but I'll check this after I film it and edit it and see if I'm right or not. And bolted to those brakes is of course the gearbox. Now then, a 2CV6 gets its name not because it's a V6, but because it has a 602cc engine. The 2CV4s of the early 70s are 435cc, whereas the 2CV6s, 4 and 6, are 602. This being a 2CV6 is a much more powerful engine, but bolted to that is a much stronger gearbox. The gearboxes of the older cars are very quiet and they're very lovely, but they are not that strong. And the 2CV6 with its increased power requires a much stronger gearbox, although they're still not the strongest thing in the world. And they are rather noisy, but with that comes one of the best gear shifts of any gearbox ever made, whereas the earlier cars can be a bit of a spongy gear shift because the actual gear shift tube and the linkage is actually rubber mounted to the shelf, so it kind of can move up and down a little bit, and it's a bit like I said, a bit spongy, whereas the 2CV6 gear shifts are very slick and very smooth and wonderful. The downside of that is that the gearboxes are incredibly noisy, and on some 2CV6s you can actually hear the gearbox before you hear the engine. Speaking of that engine, this engine is 29 horsepower, whereas this engine is a teeny tiny little 18 horsepower. What does that mean? It means that this car can cruise comfortably on the motorway at 110 kilometers an hour, whereas Jolene is stuck doing 90. So on a motorway, a 2CV6 will absolutely walk Jolene. But on roads like this, country, rural type skinny roads, Jolene could keep up no problem because she's actually much lighter. That earlier gearbox, that earlier suspension, that earlier having less stuff actually gives quite a good weight saving. So in spirited country driving, an earlier 18 horsepower can actually stand up rather well and keep up with, if not be faster than, a 2CV6. The 2CV6 is also 12 volt and has an alternator, whereas the 2CV AZA has a dynamo which is mounted in the front of the engine behind the fan. So when you actually look at the engine looks really clean and uncluttered, and the reason is there's nothing in there. The dynamo is actually built into the front of the engine, although both of these cars do share a crankcase. The crankcase, the central part of the engine, is identical in both, but that's the only part that really is. Both of them have different carburetors, different everything, including exhausts and heaters. The 2CV6 exhaust goes backwards to a collector tube and then goes down the driver's side of the car, whereas the 2CV AZA exhaust from the 425 engine comes forward down the driver's side, underneath the engine, and then to a collector in the back. And it gives a very loud exhaust, whereas this is nice and quiet and cruisy and lovely. Both of these cars have electric windscreen wipers. I know, shocking, but 63 is actually the first year for electric windscreen wipers, so only just. And she does have a fuel gauge, which again, the first year for a fuel gauge is 1963. Jolene being an AZA, AZA stands for AZ Advanced. Before that, they were all AZs. And AZL was the luxury one, which is the one with the stripe on the front in 1963. The AZA became the middle model. The AZL went from being the top model to being the bottom model, weirdly, I know. And the AZAM, or AZAM, became the top model. AZAMs have a hoop on the front, and on the front bumpers and the rear bumpers, and they have nice bench seats and nice dome lights inside, and they have a chrome strip on the front with Tradition, whereas the AZLs actually have the van tubular bumper. Another cool feature of these later 2CV6s, and it's also shared with Diane's, is they have a screen wash, whereas I have a bottle of Windex in my boot. The screen wash isn't an electric motor, it's a little foot pump, and when you drive along you squidge your foot pump and it cleans your windscreen. Like I said, being a 12 volt car, it also has a fuse box, which Jolene doesn't. 6 volt 2CVs have no fuses at all, whereas this has a fuse box and it has much more powerful lights, it has a more powerful spark. It's one of the things that gives it much more power, and it's much better at night. Jolene's headlight strength is approximate to a tea light in a jam jar. But these cars, despite all their differences, almost every single part except for the wheels, the rear doors, the front wings, one has a hole in, one doesn't, the bonnets are the same. There's a bunch of panels that they share and a bunch of panels that they don't, and they actually have less in common than they do in common. They share a great resemblance to each other, but are very different indeed. And these two cars, like I say, they drive completely differently. Both of them are absolutely wonderful to drive, and this car actually drove up here 10 hours from Nice to come and visit me, which is very nice of it, and its owners. So thank you, Amandine and Guillaume, for coming up and visiting us and bringing their lovely 2CV so I can make this video. It wasn't just so I can make this video. They've actually just come up here for a holiday and come to see if they like the area, because they're actually thinking of moving here. So that is Amandine and Guillaume's lovely 2CV6, which by the way is called Doudou, D-O-U-D-O-U, not as in poo, as in the bird, I think, I hope. And of course, Jolene is here as well, as always. Jolene is the house band, as it were. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it educational and entertaining. If you did, please click like down below. If you want to see more videos like this, please click subscribe. We've got a really nice little community growing. So please, your support is massively, massively important to me. It's really amazing, and it's really good for the growth of this channel, and it's really good for my future. So please, if you want to support me, I don't want your money. The best thing that you can do is click subscribe, click like, and share these videos with your friends, and you can do that for absolutely free. So thank you all for watching. Please don't forget to be awesome with each other. Thank you for all your lovely comments. Please be nice to each other in the comments, as always you usually are. If you have comments about these two cars, if you have opinions about these two cars, please remember that other people have opinions as well, and they may be more or less correct than yours, but that doesn't matter because everyone's allowed an opinion. And the gendarmes are coming to see what we're doing. Bonjour. Thank you all for watching. See you all in the next video. Bye bye.